Okay, steam. Now, I'm just going to underline steam. I mean, there are reasons why I play these things other than they're fun, these little videos and things. The invention of the steam engine led to the invention of the locomotive, in addition to steam-powered machines and printing presses. The locomotive meant that tracks were laid all over the place, including the United States, and those tracks became the bed for telegraph wires, and which enhanced the traveling of news and also led to eventually the concept of radio, etc., which we're going to get to in our radio lecture. So the steam engine, as a technological advance, had major impact on the development of new media types. Okay. So, continuing with our history of newspapers. In the prime time of newspapers, and I showed you this, I think, before, when Abraham Lincoln, that's him on the left there, first campaigned for president in 1860 as the unlikely nominee of the then Republican Party, which was a new political party. There were Democrats and there were Republicans, but in those days the Democrats were the somewhat pro-slavery southern branch of politics. Republicans were pro-abolition, or the doing away of slavery, and more liberal. I think you could safely say that positions are somewhat reversed today in terms of Republicans and Democrats. But Lincoln was the first Republican president, but in those days, no one campaigned for president. It was considered undignified. It wasn't done. He didn't, parade around making speeches as a presidential candidate. He did do his famous debates against Stephen Douglas, but when he did, Douglas was a senator, but Douglas wasn't really campaigning necessarily for anything, possibly the presidency, but not officially. And Lincoln wasn't anything. He held no political office, and yet he and Douglas debated abolition, slavery and abolition, all over the state of Illinois. And this is what helped make Lincoln famous. But as presidential candidate, he did not make speeches. He did not spend money on newspaper advertising or put up billboards with his face on them all over the place. He stayed home in Springfield, Illinois, and had meetings with important people who came to visit him and, have their talks and cut their deals, whatever the case may be, to become cabinet members or whatever. So very different from today's world, where billions are spent on advertising. The way Lincoln influenced public opinion in his favor and had a voice was through the editorial content side of newspapers. He wrote letters to the editor, and he particularly liked to send these letters to Horace Greeley, who was the very pro-abolition publisher of the New York Herald Tribune. And when Lincoln sent a letter with a point of view on something, the Tribune published it first, but it was picked up by newspapers, thousands of newspapers all over the country, so everyone in every city could read it. And they were usually printed up on handbills, too, these letters or speeches, and posted in places where people could read them. So Lincoln reached out to the public through the editorial side, not the earned side, I should say, not the paid side of newspapers. Now, I talked about the development of photography. James Polk was the first president to be photographed, and there he is in 1849. We made the point that the Tribune sent a number of reporters to cover the Civil War, and also there were photographers covering the war, Matthew Brady being a famous example. And he took, and I apologize for this, I know it's unpleasant, but Brady took pictures of, some during battle, but I think he tried to be safe. It was pretty dangerous being anywhere near a battlefield. But after the battlefield, he could go and take pictures of the carnage of war. And these pictures, soldiers and the like, and Civil War happenings, as well as other pictures, started showing up in newspapers to supplement just the text. Here's an example. This is the New York Times now. This is 1914. And this is, by the way, the story that was the genesis of World War I. Archduke Francis Ferdinand was shot during a visit to Sarajevo. So see, crazy assassinations and things didn't just start in our time. They've been happening for a while. But you see how the photographs of him and his wife are there, and in the New York Times. Advertising ran in the newspapers, local advertising for retail and merchants, etc., but also national advertising. And here's an old ad for some kind of chocolate thing. Now here's an ad that ran, I believe, in Europe, and this was letting people know you could book some passage on the Titanic if you wanted to, running in a newspaper. Here is a national ad. You see, they're all in black and white because papers obviously couldn't do color, right? They didn't do color really very much until USA Today, which we'll look at in a minute. Now, this was color, but it's not really a full color. It's sort of a red, green, and black printing of a coupon for Coca-Cola, which was inserted in newspapers at one point, and that's a national ad for Coca-Cola. And so we get up to, after the time of Lincoln, we go through the early 20th, the late 19th century, the early 20th century, and we have two really kind of titans of newspapers, one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast. William Randolph Hearst is the titan of newspapers on the West Coast, and Joseph Pulitzer on the East Coast. And they actually were very competitive in terms of trying to drive the news and drive public opinion, which newspapers really could do and still do, and do in Israel with those two old guys reading their favorite papers about politics. And this also gave rise to something called yellow journalism, which is the lurid kind of stories, sort of awful accidents and affairs and lurid stories that people, for some reason, like to read about. These newspapers have started to feature more and more of that kind of content to drive readership. Here's a little piece on that, phrase coined in the 1890s. Hearst and Pulitzer both were publishing in New York, and so they tried to outdo each other with sensationalism, crusades of one kind or another, Sunday features, comics, things like that, yellow journalism. I just want to say another word or two about both of these very influential people. William Randolph Hearst lived in this amazing castle overlooking the ocean in California. It was called San Simeon. He lived there with his mistress, Marion Davies, actually very, very talented actress who kind of was in some wonderful, charming performances in some early movies, including some silent movies and some speaking movies. She was his mistress, his paramour, etc., and his hostess. He had amazing weekends and guests and all kinds of influential people, Hollywood people, staying at San Simeon. And has anyone heard of the film Citizen Kane by any chance? Many regard it as one of the best films ever made. It's usually in the top 2 or 3 best films ever made. And it is a roughly simulated biography of William Randolph Hearst. And it was made by the same person, Orson Welles, who did War of the Worlds that we listened to a little while back. The brilliant genius Orson Welles, and sort of the budding of his talent when he's really challenging convention. He's only 21 or 22, I think, when his Mercury Productions that had produced War of the Worlds gets a Hollywood production contract, and he has the power to editing approval to make his own film. I'm going to show a little bit of this because I think it's pretty fascinating. First, this is Ron Howard. Another fascinating media figure, by the way. I still like watching the Andy Griffith Show. Let's skip the ad.